Hello, my loves, and welcome back to yet another episode of Strange Playgrounds. Now, I was asked in the comments section of the last video whether I'd consider doing an episode on South Korean horror, which I absolutely will do. It's been a while since I partook of any South Korean horror, but I remember when the boom happened. You know, when it was sort of towards the end of the 20th century. It was the around the late 1990s, early 2000s. There was this absolute uptick, certainly in Western markets, not just with South Korean horror, but with all sorts of Eastern horror. Like Indian horror had a moment. There was Japanese horror went berserk, obviously with the likes of Yuan and The Ring and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of stuff from South Korea, from China, from Japan, from lots of different countries in the East and the Far East that made some sort of splash here in the West. Many of them did not. Many of them you can only find online, unfortunately, because there's no distribution of them in the West at all. Things like Norori, for example. Norori is a Japanese film, and it's one of my absolute favourite horror films ever made. It is so bloody disturbing. When I first watched that film, I was on my own, and it was dark and it was cold, and I just sort of stumbled across it by accident, and I watched it, and it scared the living daylights out of me. It was one of those films whereby after watching it, I was cautious about wandering around the house without the lights on. That kind of horror film, which is wonderful. It's rare indeed that a horror film can do that to me. But yes, I will do an episode probably on all of that stuff, to be honest. I need to reacquaint myself with some of the South Korean horror specifically, because it's been a while. It has been a good long while since I partook. But yes, I will do an episode on that at some point. For the purposes of this episode, there's this odd, weird confluence of stuff happening recently, which seems to be what sparks these discussions, or these monologues, as it were. There was relatively recently, an announcement, and indeed a trailer at long last, for the BBC's His Dark Materials adaptation. Now, This is something I'm approaching with a great degree of joy, anticipation, but also caution. A great deal of caution. His Dark Materials is one of those books series that I came across very late on. I didn't even know it existed. I came across it as a result of a program that the BBC did when I was like 21 years old. They did the nation's 100 great favourite books. And it was like a month-long thing where they dedicated an episode to each book, and they had celebrities talking about it and doing documentaries about it. And I came across His Dark Materials there because it was number 3 in that series. You had the top 3 were His Dark Materials, Harry Potter, and The Lord of the Rings. And very familiar with the first 2, but not with His Dark Materials. And it sounded, when I can't remember who the celebrity was, but when he was discussing it, it sounded like just the perfect book series for me. It incorporated everything. Then I went and read about Philip Pullman and about what inspired the series, the way it was written as an antidote to the Chronicles of Narnia, which at the time I was sort of in the full flower of my atheism, and was much more aggressive and antagonistic in my atheism at that point. You know, I was 20 years old, so, you know. So something like this, which provided a similar sort of fantasy setting and similar themes and subjects, but did it from the other perspective with the other emphasis, in direct opposition to the Chronicles of Narnia, which of course are written as basically as Christian tracts. They're designed to kind of coerce children into accepting C.S. Lewis's very particular form of Christianity. That was amazing to me. So I went and bought every single book and I devoured them. I absolutely devoured them. I found that not only did my perspectives at the time chime with Pullman's, but I found that the world he created and the style of his writing was just up my alley. It's a beautiful style he's got. It's very evocative, but also very refined. It's very pared down. He writes stories almost like scripts. They're very visual. They're very kind of episodic, so you have like series of events happening within each chapter, and each event could be its own self-contained short story in many respects. But the flow and the rhythm of his writing is absolutely beautiful. It's very quick, it's very pacey, very punchy, and he creates mystery in this very beautiful way. Like he doesn't have characters standing around talking about things very much. What you get are these very impressionistic views of the world in which the story operates, and it's a world that's very familiar. It is England. It's the UK. It's a world that's very familiar, but sort of like a few steps shy of our own reality, where things are just slightly different, where there are things like demons, for example. And I love the way he doesn't belabor that point. He doesn't belabor the fact of demons or of dust or of the alethiometer and all that stuff. He doesn't belabor it. He shows you how they work. He shows you kind of what they're for, but allows you to intuit a lot about them. So demons are never fully explained. There's never a situation where characters sit down and tell you what demons are or why they exist. In the world that Pullman creates, demons are just natural parts of reality. Every human being is born with a demon, and it's an animal avatar. It's a sort of reflection of their soul, of their inner spirit. And it reflects certain aspects of their personality. So when people are children, they shift and change and they can become like moths or ferrets or whatever, but they start to solidify as they grow older and as their personalities coalesce, and the demon becomes static. It becomes a particular creature that reflects their personality. It's very cool. It's very cool. It's a great concept because it's one of those wonderful concepts that lends itself to, on a very mercenary level, marketing, if nothing else, because people read the book and they like to think like, well, what would my demon be? If I had an animal avatar that reflected my inner personality, what would it be? And, you know, a lot of people would love to, as the book itself points out, a lot of people would love to romanticize that. So, people, you know, you get some people like, oh, mine would be a wolf, or mine would be a raven or a crow or something like that. When in fact, the demons that they would have turn out to be like fluffy bunnies or something like that, to that effect. It points out that a lot of people who are in conflict with themselves are often in conflict with their demons. They have problems with their demons and with the shapes that they've taken. And so they are neurotic. They're people who are in conflict with themselves. But it adds this layer of interaction and interpretation and ethics to this world that Pullman goes into great detail about. For example, the way demons interact and the way human beings interact with other people's demons have this incredible amount of... There's this incredible etiquette applied to it, whereby, for example, you don't touch other people's demons. It's considered taboo. It's considered a violation. It's far too intimate, unless you are romantically involved or your family or something to that effect. It's really cool. It's a really beautiful, brilliant concept. And then mingled with that, you have this incredible story about the lie of childhood innocence and about how the lie of that has caused so much pain and leads to so much abuse. I mean, literally to the deaths of children in many instances, certainly in this story. It's a smouldering, blistering attack upon the way we preconceive of children in our societies, and the way we talk to them, and the way we stunt their imaginations, and the way we try to condition them with our own neurotic perspectives and restrictions, and the way we enshrine our own neuroses in our systems, in our religious institutions, in our legal institutions, in our educational institutions. It's quite brilliant. What you've got counterposed to Lewis's authoritarian perspective, where in the Chronicles of Narnia, everyone bows down to Aslan. Aslan is the ultimate authority, and if you don't bow down to him, you don't do as he says it, then you're going to be punished, basically. In his Dark Materials, you have this incredible metaphysical anarchism this incredible anarchism where, yeah, there is magic and there are metaphysics. There's even an afterlife. There is even a kind of afterlife in this universe, but it's pantheistic. There's no god that determines where you go or anything like that. There is a god, but it's a slightly different style of being. There's a greater truth beyond that god, and the greater metaphysics is that you become part of the universe. You become part of the systems and the stuff of reality, which is what dust is. It's kind of like, it's the essential stuff. It's never explained, but the notion of dust pervades all of reality in his Dark Materials. It is this essential stuff, like the glue that holds reality together. But it's also the stuff of inspiration, it's the stuff of dreams, it's the stuff of potential. It's like the first stuff, the fundamental stuff from which all things are created. And it's to what we return, ultimately, when we die. All of our potential, all of our experience goes into it to feed into new life, into new dreams, into new states of being. It's absolutely beautiful. And the forces of authority, I mean, quite literally, one of the key antagonists is called the Authority, and it's God, essentially. He is God. He's the Abrahamic God. And his institutions, his followers, they seek to stunt that. They seek to control that, to impose and enshrine lies. It's really beautiful. It's really quite stunning. It's a brilliant attack upon the Chronicles of Narnia, and it establishes how dark and how worrying the assumptions of authority within that series are. I say it's something of an interesting coincidence that this has occurred, the BBC adaptation has occurred at this point, and it is because I've just rediscovered the Chronicles of Narnia. I'm one of these people who used to read the books all the time as a kid, loved the original BBC series, and I love them still. Despite my problems, I had that very classic arc with the Chronicles of Narnia. They were some of the first books I ever read as a kid when I was like 5 years old, probably earlier. I loved them. Loved the BBC series. When I was a teenager and I was starting to develop my atheism, I started to see what Lewis was doing and felt very betrayed by it. I felt like I was being coerced and had a very angry antithetical reaction and put them away for the longest time. But as I've aged and as I've learnt more about Lewis and as I've softened, I suppose, in my perspectives, I've returned to them and started to appreciate them for what they were to me as a young man, as a young imaginer, as a young writer, and what they may still be. I'm rereading them right now, as a matter of fact. I'm rereading them right now. I've just finished The Magician's Nephew. For the first time in years, I'm rereading them. I've just finished The Magician's Nephew. Massively enjoyed it. Yeah, it does suffer from the agenda, as all the books do. The agenda is very stark, it's very clear. There's a lot of stuff where Lewis is just he is literally just trying to browbeat the reader into accepting his perspectives, and it's a little bit much. There are problems with, like, the gender roles in it. There's a lot of enshrinement of women and of girls in the same way that you would find in The Lord of the Rings that is fairly misogynistic, and women and girls being told that they don't do that because they're girls and because they're women. There's the automatic assumption of authority of Aslan, which is really problematic. But there are images in it I absolutely love. There's elements of its metaphysics I absolutely love. You get to learn where the White Witch comes from, where the world of Charn, which is this dying world that she and her kind basically destroyed. There's this wonderful notion, which I didn't realise, this links back to what I was talking about in the last video, I didn't realise I've incorporated it into my own metaphysics, into the stuff and images that I talk about in my own fiction. There's this notion of the wood between the worlds. In The Magician's Nephew, you find that there is this wood that exists between all of realities. It's sort of like a nowhere place. It's where Aslan comes from. And it has pools in it. And each of these pools leads to a different reality. It's kind of cool. I love it. And I've written about... I didn't realise, not consciously, it wasn't like conscious plagiarism or anything, but I've written about woods between worlds a lot in my fiction. abstraction. There is, in my wider metaphysics, this notion of a wood. It's very different from Lewis's, but it is the wild wood. It's the wood of potential and of abstraction and of our most fundamental human nightmares and dreams and inspirations and of the stories we used to tell around the campfire when we were just tribes. It's so cool. I never realised it was there, but there it is. There it is in the Chronicles of Narnia, whose metaphysics I generally disagree with and have problems with. So yeah, that's my history with the Chronicles of Narnia. I've come back to it now, and I love the BBC adaptation. I have a real affection for. It's ropey, it's overly theatrical, it's often very questionable, but I really, really love it. I rewatched them all recently, and they are wonderful. They have this real sort of earnestness to them, this heightened theatricality where everything feels very dreamlike and not quite sincere and not quite legitimate, but it works. It's like a big old fantasy pantomime. And it's wonderful. It is absolutely wonderful. For all of its problems, for all of the issues I have with it, I can now take from it what I enjoy and what I find inspiring and question the other stuff. And believe me, there's a lot to question because these books are horrendously racist. They're horrendously misogynist. The Last Battle, the last one, which I believe I've discussed before in this series, is the one that people read and then take against, because that's the one where he makes the agenda overt. It's the one where basically Aslan kills everyone. He kills everyone he's ever created, every world he's ever created. He just rolls up and destroys arbitrarily because they're not satisfying to him. It celebrates the deaths of children, The Last Battle, because they get to die innocent or whatever. It's absolutely appalling, and that's the one that makes a lot of people angry. By the way, if you want to see a real rant against C.S. Lewis from a contemporary, go and find a video with, I think it's Alan Garner, the guy who wrote The Weird Stone of Brisingamen, he was a contemporary fantasy writer of Lewis's. Go and watch it. It's really good. He hates Lewis with a smouldering, fiery passion. He calls him a corrupter of innocence and of imagination. I'm not quite as fiery as that, but I can definitely see where he's coming from, and I can see why Pullman wrote his Dark Materials. As someone who celebrates imagination and the freedom of it, who sees the potential for inspiring children and of encouraging their inquisitiveness and indeed their perversity, because children do have an innate perversity. They really do. Anyone who knows anything about child behaviorism, about child psychology, even passingly, who just sits and likes to watch children play, knows that they have this curiosity, this perversity, this willingness to question the world around them that's absolutely wonderful, and to just conjure, to just imagine outside of any bounds or restrictions. That's what his Dark Materials celebrates in the face of the restrictiveness and authoritarianism of the Chronicles of Narnia. That's what it's designed to do, to not just present an antidote or a counter-argument, but to present an alternative. That's what it's for. What Pullman's hoping happens is that children will go and read this, and they'll feel inspired. They will feel that they can create their own sense of self without having it imposed by authority figures or institutions. That's what his Dark Materials is about. Now, for me, his Dark Materials is an absolute fucking gift of a book to adapt, because it's even written in a script-like form. It should be easy. It should be so easy to convert to a cinematic format or to a TV format. However, I'm sure we all remember The Golden Compass, a film so bad that it ended on an unnecessary cliffhanger in the full anticipation that it would be a trilogy, and it was so bad that the very notion of another set of films was just nixed almost immediately. It was an atrocious horror of a film. It really was. It's confusing. I took my mum to see it because my mum and I have very similar tastes in fiction, and I was hoping that it would inspire her to read it. But she came out of it like, I didn't understand a word of that, because it is such a confusing, muddling mess of a film. It does this awful thing at the beginning where all of the mystery that's in the original book, which is called The Northern Lights in the UK, not The Golden Compass, by the way, all the mystery about dust, about demons, about that actually feeds into the narratives that swell in the later books. It's all explained at the fucking beginning in a voiceover. Everything that drives the plot, all the mysteries, all the curiosities are explained badly, but so badly that it's impossible to tell unless you've read the books what's going on. My mum didn't know coming out of it what demons were. She didn't understand why there were these talking animals everywhere. She didn't understand what the hell anybody was talking about with dust or why the alethiometer worked. And it's such a shame because certain elements of it are perfect. Nicole Kidman as Miss Coulter, perfect. Daniel Craig as Lord Azrael, absolutely spot on perfect. That guy who plays, I can never remember his name, but the character who has the hot air balloon, just pristine, perfect casting. And Ian McKellen as Yorick Bernison, the bear. It's just perfect. And they make a mess of it. They make a hash of it. I don't know how that's possible. Not only that, it was cowardly, and that's my big fear for all adaptations of His Dark Materials. You've got to be very careful because it is a blistering assault upon authoritarianism, upon churches, upon certain kinds of government and education. It makes a lot of people very angry, to the point whereby it's been banned in certain areas of the United States, where the teaching of it in schools or having it in school libraries has been very questionable. It can make people very angry. And my fear for any adaptation, particularly a BBC adaptation, is that it will be cowardly. It will not contain the assaults and the attacks and the criticisms that the book has for these institutions, for fear of drawing criticism. You know, the BBC has been very conservative for a very long time as a result of blowbacks from things like Jerry Springer, the opera. So my fear is that it will be diluted and that it will be softened in terms of its viciousness, and that will kill the story, because the bad guys in this fiction are the church. They are an equivalent of the Catholic Church, this world's equivalent of it. They're called the Magisterium. And it is attacking that institution, but lots of other institutions as well. And you cannot legitimately do the story unless it contains those criticisms and those edges. It just won't work. My hope for it is that this will do for current generations of children what the old 1980s Chronicles of Narnia adaptation did for us. I hope it will be so good that children now will be inspired by it. They'll go and read the books. They will take on board its lessons. They'll be massively inspired by its imagery, and they'll become writers and creators and artists in their own rights. That's my sincere hope. And there is some basis for that. Does anybody remember the absolutely blisteringly brilliant adaptation of Mr. Norrell and Jonathan Strange they did a few years back? Probably not, because it was swept totally under the radar, and it is such a shame because that adaptation was perfect. It was absolutely spot on perfect. That adaptation was one of the best things the BBC have done in recent years, and it's just been buried. It is such a shame. But if they can bring that quality to their adaptation of His Dark Materials, it could be something very special indeed. It could be the kind of thing that talks to children, not as children, not in a condescending adults, well, we know what kids like kind of way, but as people. In the same way that media like Adventure Time does, or Steven Universe, it could be spectacular. This could be something that puts the BBC on the map again when it comes to book adaptations and fantasy. It's got to be good. This series has a fan base like you wouldn't believe. They are passionate, they are rabid, they are very, very engaged with their fiction, and it's got to be good. It's got to be good. I just hope it is. For their sake, for the sakes of the children who could be inspired by it, I sincerely hope it is. As a counterpoint, not just to C.S. Lewis, but to J.K. Rowling as well, to the likes of Harry Potter, which, I mean, I don't mind that people like Harry Potter or anything like that, or that people are inspired by it, or that they're engaged with it, but there are sincere problems I have with that series of books. Sincere problems with its classism, with the way it makes magic banal. It makes the miraculous and the insanely beautiful and brilliant, not transcendental, but contains it as this frippery, as just a way of almost like convenience of being able to magic things away, you know, for a privileged few. I really hate that. I really, really, really hate that, and I will discuss that on a future episode of Strange Playgrounds. So yes, I mean, that's why what I'm going to do after I finish reading the Chronicles of Narnia, out of sheer perversity, I'm going to go and read His Dark Materials directly after I finished, to see what emotions they evoke, to see how the two stories engage me again, and how they work counterpointed to one another. I think that could be a very interesting experiment indeed. So yes, I mean, look out for the new BBC adaptation and expect a full review up here when it finally airs. Believe me, I'm going to be glued to that. Absolutely glued to it. I mean, next time I will either talk about Korean horror and Eastern horror, or I will talk about my distaste for Harry Potter. Until then, ladies and gents, bye-bye!